Welcome. It's good to see everybody today. I'm Christopher Davidson, State Archivist of Georgia, Assistant Vice Chancellor with the University System. Georgia Archives is part of the University System of Georgia. We answer to the system office in Atlanta. Our monthly Lunch and Learn programs are sponsored by the Friends of Georgia Archives and History. Thank you to FOGA. If you haven't noticed, there's some refreshments back in the back. I think some chips and water that's sponsored by FOGA. So feel free to get up throughout and get those. There's a new brochure, which is on the back table as well. There's also a donation box if you're interested in donating to FOGA. Talks about the benefits of FOGA, and if you're interested in joining, has the information on how to join. And FOGA is the Friends of the Georgia Archives. If you'd like to donate directly to the archives, you can. There's on our website a give button. I think it's red. It's very obvious. Click on that, and you can go through and donate. After this presentation, if you want to do research in our reference room and look to see what we have. If you do not have a researcher card, just go down to the front desk, sign up, and you get a researcher card. It's good for 5 years. If you do have a researcher card, we ask that you go down, sign in with the guard at the front that you're going to research, and go on to the back. We used to have 2 guards, which made the process easier. Now, budget cuts, we only have 1 right now. So you just make sure you sign in at the front before you go to the back. We're happy today to welcome Dr. Vincent Willis. He'll be presenting in just a few minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to have a door prize drawing. Or are they in this? Point out thank you for kind of bearing with us as we kind of got some of the technical difficulties today. It used to run much smoother before our education coordinator left us for Clayton State. But she's here with us today, Penny Cliff. So hopefully it'll be a little smoother. She normally would give all the introductions. I'm doing it now. Tracy Johnson is kind of filling in on some of Penny's activities until we can hire a new person to take Penny's place. If you know of anyone that might be interested, that job is open on the University System of Georgia's HR page, and we're taking applications now. So we have a copy of Vanishing Georgia. We try to give it out as a door prize at each of our Lunch and Learns. It has images from some of the specific collections at the archives. So we encourage you to look on our website. You can see the images that are also found in this book.
Oh, we put it. Wow,
It's all on you.
no problem.
Number ending in 730. 730. Anybody have 730? 4811730. That's all.
No,
You think what? Nobody has 730. Must have lost somebody.
Try again. Try again. Try again. All right.
How about 742? 742. You want again?
No.
Okay. We'll try again. The Bramlets are here alive.
All right, let's see.
35. All right. It's difficult to give these away. Your very own copy of Vanishing Georgia. So tell your friends, oh, thank you. They want a chance for a vanishing Georgia. They should come back next month. All right. Vincent Willis is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary social sciences in New College with an appointment in gender and race studies at the University of Alabama. He earned his PhD in educational history from Emory University, an MA in African and African American Studies from the Ohio State University, and a BA in African American Studies from Morehouse College. His work centers on the historical ideas and actions of Black youth to operationalize a more inclusive concept of educational equality. Additionally, his work investigates the consequences of educational policy, federal and local, operating unapologetically oppositional for decades to over-resource white schools and grossly underfund Black schools, and opposing the improvements Black youth demanded. Welcome, Vincent.
All right. Introductions are always weird. When people tell you what you have done, it always seems like it's, tooting your own horn, but I guess it's part of what we do. So before I start on this presentation, I want to begin by saying how thankful I am to be here, to be invited. I participated in the 4-part class about education and desegregation in Georgia that Penny and Tamika, I believe, I'm not messing up your name, right? And Tamika hosted last fall. And so I know it was a grant that, that sponsored it. So I'm hoping that they were able to continue. That was very informative. So I want to thank Penny and Tamika, especially for bringing me back into the fold. It's been years since I've been at the Georgia Archives and working on not only this book, but other projects. So I want to, first of all, thank you all. Thank Tracy for picking up where Penny left off. I know I was invited a couple of times and my schedule got hectic, and so I had to adjust some dates. So I do appreciate that Tracy for continuing where Penny started, and thank all of you all who are brave the weather and the rain to come on your Friday to have a conversation with me. And of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank the leadership at Georgia Archives and all of you all who had anything to do with the Lunch and Learn lecture. Is that the proper name? I think I messed it up downstairs. I call it the Lecture and Learn. So, but it's the Lunch and Learn lecture. So I want to continue, I guess, conversation that preceded me, and hopefully, set other foundations for those that will continue this important work that we are doing in this moment. And before I get started with the actual crux of the work, I want to start off by saying a little bit about myself prior to my education. And I told a couple of audience members before we started that I was born and raised in Jacksonville, Arkansas. And so I am a country boy at heart. I am from a small town, and we all know what that can consume in America. And so I know some of you all may know one of the people on the in this PowerPoint slide. We know Baldwin, James Baldwin, who was one of the most known literary scholars of the 20th century. If you have not read any of James Baldwin's work, I encourage you to read James Baldwin's work. There's a documentary on Netflix, I'm Not Your Negro, that's really good. So just Google James Baldwin. Anything you pick up from him will give you keen insight on race in America, and not only race in America, but also humanity in America and justice in America, things like that. The other person that's on this slide is my great-grandmother. Her name is Margaret Kraft. And she was born in 1913. She passed in 2004. And I wanted to elevate my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who we affectionately call grandmother, family dynamics. Because not necessarily just because it's International Women's History Month, but and the more education I receive, formal education I receive, or schooling as they would say in my neighborhood, the more I realized how pivotal my upbringing was to the work that I do. And so I know in the academy, we often talk about positionality, which is just a famous word for like, you know, how your upbringing or your personality or your person, you know, influence the work, right? You know, we have this thing about objectivity and subjectivity in the academy and these research, but who we are comes through our work, right? We don't do it separate from our work. And so my grandmother or my great grandmother used to have this saying that she used to say to her kids, who, you know, was my grandfather and auntie, and then her grandkids was, you know, my mother and her siblings, and then my mother passed it on to me. And she used to have this saying that love demands something, right? And she used to say it all the time, right? With very little, with no more elaboration, right? That love demands something. That if you love something, there's something that you demand of that, whatever that thing is, right? And so as I move throughout my academic careers, as my guy just so wonderfully explained about my schooling, I came across these ideas about emotions and teaching and the effectiveness of teaching and what does that mean. So I don't know if any of you all know Neil Notting's work. So she has the notion of caring. Dr. Siddle Walker's work, or Hello Professor, talks about, and Dr. Bias, and he talks about how you can't love what you don't teach, or you can't love if you can't love what you not only you can't love what you don't teach, but you have to love who you're teaching, right? So this ideal about teacher-student relationships, and then Baldwin quote has always stuck with me, right? And this is why when I talk about merging the personal with the academic, and this hopefully will all come together shortly. When Baldwin argues in this wonderful quote, "We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist," right? And so as the baseline, I want to begin this conversation as thinking about how we understand what it is that we do, right? Regardless if you're in the educational field, regardless if you're a parent with a student in the educational field, what does that mean to have a interconnection, right? A relationship with the thing that you're in, right? What does that mean? How do we create institutions? How do we address institutions that denies one humanity, right? What are we demanding of those institutions, right? And at the crux of my interest into understanding what young people are really asking for, I think, well, I would argue that's the common denominator, right? It's they have a vision, ideal about the world in which they want to live in, right? Ideals about the schools in which they want to be educated in, right? And there's always this constant friction, right? Or this constant tension that exists when those things do not exist, right? Or those things are at competing odds with each other. And so I bring my personal self, you know, a product of Margaret Kraft, right, into this conversation, and also just learned, you know, schooling, right? This idea that we are not separate from these institutions that we enter, right? And that our humanity is not divorced, or the denial of our humanity is not divorced from those institutions, right? And so how do we understand it? And so I that is the baseline in which I began this conversation with. And so the question I have for all of us to think about today is, what is your role in the fight for justice? What is your role in the fight for justice? The historical activism of Black youth provides answers. And when I began this conversation, when I began this research journey about 10 to 15 years ago, I always had an interest in wanting to know what young people were doing during, you know, these movements, right? And we whether you want to talk about the women's suffrage movements of the early 20th century, the student movement of the early 20th century, the civil rights movement of the, you know, mid 20th century, the Black Power movement, right, of the mid 20th century, or Black Lives Matter, or whatever movement you want to think about in this journey of activism in America, young people are oftentimes, I don't want to say ignored, but at least placed in the periphery, right? That activism or social movements are oftentimes given to the adults, right? It's the adults who are elevated, whether it's the kings of the world or the Fannie Lou Hamers of the world. And I'm not saying that the adults shouldn't be. I'm not pitting these individuals against each other, right? But I'm saying for a more holistic understanding, right, for a fuller picture of these social movements, then young people voices and actions have to be included, right? And so that was really, again, the point of me studying young voices. And so again, the early parts of this work, it was on just like student activism throughout the South, right? And so I was not only talking about Georgia, I was talking about Alabama, I was looking at Arkansas, with the Little Rock Nine, I was talking about what's going on in Florida, all of these different places, particularly in the mid-1960s, where you have student activism just popping up, well, not popping up, student activism occurring, right, in Birmingham and all these different places throughout throughout the 1960s. And so giving, there's certain time limits and certain resources that we have to, as researchers, that we have to do, or certain decisions we have to make because of, should I say, time limits and certain resources. I focused on Georgia, and I kept noticing that, I don't know if anybody from Southwest Georgia in there, I kept noticing that was, okay, we got a Southwest Georgia person here, and got the book, all right, we would talk. So I kept noticing that there was this constant occurrence of student activism in Southwest Georgia, particularly between from 1960 to 1970. I'm not saying to stop there, but that was the time frame I was looking at anyway. And so Audacious Agitation is a case study of youth activism from 1954 to 1972, and I'm focused mainly on three areas, three cities. So Tifton, you from Tifton? Okay, Tifton, Georgia, Americus, Georgia, and Moultrie, Georgia, right? And so those are the three, those are the three areas that my book is focused on, right? And so I looked at student activism in Georgia, specifically in Southwest Georgia. And so I argue, and so we'll spend the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, have this conversation about what does this activism look like, right? Not only the context in which this activism took place, but what are some of the things in which they were asking? What are some of the things in which they were demanding? And I, as an educational historian, for one, am not a believer that history is just for the past. I believe history is forever present, right? History is the birth parent of the present, and so it's constantly interconnected. Bless you. And so, if there's anyone in here who think that history is just things that happened in the past and have no relevance to the future, then you and I probably are going to disagree a lot, and that's fine, right? But just philosophically, I just want to. The reason why I'm asking the question about what is your role in the fight for justice, because I believe that there are these historical ways in which we can think about the past and that's relevant to the future, right? And so I want to begin by disrupting what I call this kind of unidirectional narrative that education is often told through, right? So people normally tend to have this belief or this desire to want to always place America on a forward track, right? That America is in this constant projection of perfecting its democratic ideas, right? That people tend to acknowledge on some level that there's always been this contradiction, right? That the Declaration, that you're endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit, happiness, and that America also had slavery and blah blah blah, and that as many people say, the original sin, right, has created that tension. And since that tension, though, since the end of slavery, America has been, going on this kind of upward trajectory, right? And my goal, again, is not, as I tell students, is not to convince you about where America is on your greatness of countries. That's not what I'm here for. I am here, though, to complicate our understanding of what America is, right? And what America is to certain people. And it may be a great place to you, but it may be a complicated place to somebody else because of all of these different factors. And how do we understand these contradictory narratives, right? And so what I would argue is that, yes, America particularly within the educational system, legalized segregation. We understand Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, and that pretty much existed, was the law of the land until Brown v. Board in 1954. And then we kind of tout this story that, oh, well, once black and white children started occupying the same space, America got better. Why are we still complaining about that, right? I would argue again that the activism of black youth in the 1950s, post-Brown, presents a very different narrative, right? It complicates that narrative of this upward trajectory. And one of the ways in which it complicates that narrative is, I'm gonna read from a passage, is about how a number of times activism was unwelcome in Southwest Georgia. So we take Americas, right? And for this talk, unfortunately, if I know, I'd have had some Americas, some Tifton folks, and some Moultrie folks, and I would have focused more on. Okay, all right. So, but for this talk, I'm only going to focus on Americas, not because I like Americas more. It's just, when I give these talks, I randomly choose what I'm gonna focus on. So, again, the reason why we have to complicate this narrative, right, this kind of progressive narrative, because we understand the hostility that took place in, after Brown, right? Not only, we talk a lot about white flight, we talk a lot, but it was more than just about white people not wanting black people in schools, right? And so one of the ways we have to think about the hostility is America provides a great insight about the insurrection charge that was filed against youth activists and members of SNCC. And so I'm gonna read from the passage I'm reading from the book, and I want you to think about the hostility in which youth activism is taking place, right? The context in which it is taking place. So, okay. So blacks grew up in Americas were all too often familiar with the overt forms of opposition. They became much more familiar with the white opposition that the more they pushed for alternative ways to live. Sam Mahone, a native of Americas and member of SNCC, recalled the savagery adopted by whites to suppress any movement towards equality. Charging young protesters with sedition was one of the tools local officials used to quell any social movements in Americas. Ironically, this propelled the town into national significance because of the implications the case had on the civil rights movement, and it increased the participation of those involved in the movement. In October 1963 article in the Washington Post reported that 4 demonstrators arrested in Americas, John Perdue, Zev Aloni, Ralph Allen, and Don Harris faced insurrection charges, which carried a maximum death penalty upon conviction. The article began by noting that a Georgia prosecutor said yesterday that he has changed his mind and will prosecute 4 civil rights demonstrators on charges of inciting insurrection, and quoted him as saying that the basic reason for bringing these charges was to deny the defendant's bond. It is important to note that the prosecutor was unaware of the possible severity of the penalties under charges, but nevertheless, when he became aware of it, he did not change the charges. The prosecutor was primarily concerned with how to keep the leaders of the movement in jail, so he reportedly poured through law books to find a strong law to keep the young man out of circulation. What began as an arrest for participation in a demonstration in 1962 turned into a death penalty case by 1963. Although the sedition trial and its ruling proved pivotal to the movement, the events that transpired before the insurrection charges were filed were important as well. And I won't go into all that. I just kind of stay with the sedition charge. Sam Mahone remembered vividly the fear and nervousness by this case because of the potential consequences that it had on those involved in the movement writ large. He said, quote, if they had been successful in finding them guilty, it would have literally stopped the movements around the country, end quote. Had it not been for the panel of 3 federal judges who agreed to hear the case, it is conceivable that Mahone's fear for the movement would have been borne out. However, the judges did intercede and eventually ruled in favor of those falsely accused of insurrection. On October 31st, 1963, a federal judge panel ruled that jailing and sedition charges was unconstitutional and ordered the immediate release of Perdue, Maloney, Allen, and Harris. This decision was essential to the continuation of the social movements throughout the country because the acts that defendants were being charged for their strategies taught, and used by most civil rights organizations, right? And so if we think about, again, what is occurring after Brown, right? What is occurring after our ideas of thinking that once segregation or once Brown was passed, that things became better for a number of people, right? And again, that does not mean that Brown is insignificant. We can have that conversation another day because Brown is, I'm not arguing that Brown is insignificant. What I am arguing is that after 1954, we also, the hostility did not go away, right? There was a whole lot of things that undergirded, right, Jim Crow, a whole lot of ideologies that fueled Jim Crow that remained after Jim Crow was ruled unconstitutional. And we have to understand not only examples like the sedition charges that occurred in Americas, but also other things that happened throughout Southwest Georgia and the country writ large. It shows us a much more complicated history. And what do we do, again, as we think about our role in the fight for justice? What do we do when we are confronted with these kind of social and political and legal hostilities, right? And I argue again that this history provides a excellent insight for us to think about how to go forward. And so in Americas, what you have is you have SNCC, and for those who don't know what SNCC is, the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, which was mostly filled with college-age students. You know, one of the most effective young youth organizations in the country at the time. They were in Southwest Georgia and working with different groups who were fighting for justice, or who were fighting, you know, against equality, whatever word you want to use. And what you have, though, is within this context, right, you have this hostile nature, right? You have all of these things going on. You have not only these insurrections, you also have, you know, police brutality at its high. So you have this climate that existed, and even with this climate that existed, you have a number of young black youth who are determined to fight against this system, right? Who are determined to think about life very differently than what they are experiencing. And so I want to move before we get into the Q&A. I want to move into thinking about what are some of the things or some of the ideas that resonate with you as we think about what young people were saying. And so again, this is from the Americas movement as we think about it. The inhumane treatment experienced by those who push for an alternative way was not abstract. It was real and often personal. Black students in America decided to join the movement because they had relatives and or friends in situations that disregarded their humanity or had experienced second-class treatment themselves. Many of them joined the movement because they were persuaded by a sibling or a peer. Seeing a sibling treated inhumanely was extremely difficult, such is the case for Lorena Sabbs, who followed her sibling into the movement. She remembered how she and others responded to their classmates and siblings being locked up. Quote, "We had protested all summer long, and of course, most of the people who were locked up during that time were students. My own brother had been in jail maybe 2 months under deplorable circumstances. So when school started to open, we campaigned to parents. We did everything, saying if all of our classmates cannot go back to school, then nobody should go back to school." End quote. Undoubtedly, the decision to stay out of school was personal. The constant proximity to white oppression left room for detachment. Black youth knew ultimately about their guardians' disenfranchisement and what occurred to those who attempted to change that reality. This personalization drew them to the movement. In Americas, the overlapping of these various forms of personal mistreatment ignited a movement. Mistreatment was the primary reason students petitioned parents to keep their children out of school in the summer of 1963. The strategy employed by local youth, along with SNCC, appeared to be ineffective initially, according to the Atlanta Daily World. Only 2/3 of students did not report to Staley, and Staley was the Staley was the school that most Black students remain attending after Brown in Americas on the first day of class. A tweak, however, in the strategy increased the number of Black youth participating, which would eventually change the effectiveness of the movement. Instead of concentrating on parents, Black youth who had been in jail and released became the most effective recruiters of other youth. White officials' tactics of releasing some youth from jail appears to have been aimed at quelling the school boycott. However, freeing those students became the primary reason the boycott increased. Because they were students at Staley, they had access to their fellow classmates. SABS remembered recruiting other students in the school. The goal was, quote, to close the school down. And on the first day of school, we were protesting outside in our little perimeter to ask students to turn around and go in. And of course, you still had some that went in. But what I personally did, and this is SABS still talk, what I personally did with other protesters was we went to school, end quote. SABS was in the 7th grade and went into the school under the premise that she was going to class. What we did, and SABS again talking, what we did though is go from classroom to classroom, asking our friends to please leave, end quote. Their recruitment strategy resulted in Wilson being nearly emptied out, end quote. And so again, what we see in this movement, right, is about young people understanding or having an idea, right, about how they should be treated, right? But the reality of so the gap between how one think they should be treated and how they were treated, right? And so what SABS and what the student movement in the Americas movement at least talks about is how the ideal of, again, treatment, or how the ideal of one's, this idea that Baldwin talks about, right? The recognizing of one's humanity, right? The idea that we can disagree on certain fundamental things, but if the denial of my humanity, or if there's not a fundamental basic necessity of our treatment, right? If then it's almost difficult for you and I to have a conversation, right? Or almost difficult for us to live in harmony, right? And so what students at Staley understood is that at a baseline level, right? As my grandma used to say, at a baseline level, that love demands something, that something was a recognition of my humanity, right? That we can talk about English, we can talk about our subject-verb agreements, we can talk about, or we cannot even talk about our subject-verb agreements. We can't talk about math or these fundamental things until you recognize me as a human being. And so the last thing I would say before I get to my 4 points, and then hopefully open it up so we can have a dialogue about your thoughts about not only the student movement but certain things, is how this America's movement came to a head. So like their peers were doing in Albany and Tifton, Black students in Americas wanted to bring awareness to the nature of the conditions they face, which they did. In addition to introducing their suffering to the nation, they illuminate their agency. Blacks in Americas and those who were assisting in the fight for equality were not passive victims. From the insurrection trial to the young girls being held hostage in the Leesburg Stockade, and if you want to read more about that, Ebony posted did a story on the Lost Girls, which was a tragic story, and you can Google Leesburg Stockade, Lost Girls in like the 1960s, in that article come up. I didn't focus on that more in this talk, but I go more into depth in the book. The nation saw them as nonviolent participatory actors in the dehumanization action taking place in America. As Black youth experienced various demeaning ordeals, their desire and willingness to be treated as human beings did not diminish. For example, when Carol Bonner, one of the stolen girls, was asked by a magistrate, quote, this is what the judge asked, if you would promise to stay away from the protests and other mess in the future, she retorted angrily, quote, mess? What mess? Barner told the reporter, "We were willing to do what we had to do to gain our freedom," end quote. Their perseverance and willingness to sacrifice resulted in more youth becoming aware of the circumstances because of what transpired as stated. A return to school meant that the tactic of a boycotting school to achieve equal treatment had run its course. Irrespective of what members of the school board thought, those involved in the Americas movement understood they had other tactics available to them, and they intended to use all of them. By the time the momentum and the participation in the Americas movement declined in the early 1970s, the political, social, and educational sectors had all been challenged, right? And so as we think about young Black people, and again, this is just a snapshot of their determination to fight, right? And as we think about these histories, I would then argue, so then what is our role, right? What do we do with this history? How do we understand that these moments in time present not only snapshots, but also provide blueprints for us in these modern days, right? And I would argue that the first thing we have to do, regardless of what local politicians want us to believe, regardless if it's here in Georgia or in Florida or whatever else, there's a number of people who want us to think that comfort, right, one's feelings is the most important thing. And I would argue that that's a disservice to the activism that preceded us. That's a disservice to the ability for this room to exist. Not only for a Black person with a PhD to be standing in front of you all talking about this, but also to, again, this is Women's Month, right? It does a disservice to the fight that people before us or that preceded us had to do, right? And while we are thinking about our role, I would argue that our awareness is in stark contrast of our comfortability, right? That becoming aware of these things, and even people, and I want to say this publicly because I understand the trauma that has accompanied these now experienced adults, but the trauma that they experienced as a youth is still there. Lorraine Stabs, who is who's very instrumental in this work, when I was interviewing her, she's like, that 14-year-old girl is still in there somewhere, right? That experienced this trauma, that went through this thing, right? And so the awareness, I would argue, our role is first to become aware of these things, to understand that for activism or for social justice to take place, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And that uncomfortableness comes at awareness. The idea that these things exist, or not only do they exist, but they have remnants to it, right? And so in the first steps, I argue, as thinking about what we can do in the fight for social justice. And this is not just dealing with just education inequities or racial inequities. I would argue these 4 steps can be applied to if you are environmentalist, right? If you're concerned about what's going on in the environment, if you're concerned about what's going on with LGBTQIA plus issues, if you're concerned about what's going on with any other issues, awareness is in direct contrast of one's comfort. That we have to become, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And in that awareness, being able to accept our, as I say, our ugly beauty is part of that, right? The second thing I would argue that we have that we could do is to confront these issues in any way, right? Now, in protesting, as I've argued, it's not for everyone, right? Everyone is not going to lead a social movement. Everyone is not going to participate in a social. But confront, as Baldwin once argued, can happen on multiple levels. This can happen in your own local community, right? If you hear somebody say something about a particular person or a particular community that's not flattering, or that's unbecoming. And I'll tell you a personal story. My wife probably be upset about me because if it has something to do with my son. My oldest son yesterday was talking to his brother, and this is my first time hearing this, and he doesn't hear from my house. And so he said, "That's gay." He was talking to his brother. I was like, "What does that mean?" He's like, "Oh, it means it's yucky." I was like, "Well, if you think about it, think about what you're saying, right? You saying that something's gay is yucky. What about people who are gay? Are you saying they yucky, right?" He's like, "No, I'm not saying that." So I was like, "Well, think about the language you use." And so we have to be honest when we think about our roles in the fight for social justice. This is not always about things that are being seen or things that are always going to be written in a book. Some of this stuff is just about us checking people in our own community, right? Confronting the inequities that we allow to exist in our own institutions, right? And so these are macro and micro levels of confrontation that we have. This is not always you going to run for office or challenging a person in your on some grand scale. So these things again, so confront and demand, right? Demand that these things are, that these social issues are not part of our world going forward. And the last thing I would say before I open up for questions is what Dr. Adichie talks about, our need to reimagine. And this is one thing I always have to tell students about, because it's a hope and it's also an indictment, right? We can choose to live a different world because we have chosen to live the world we're living. It's not the racism and sexism and classism and all these other isms. It's something are things that human beings created, are things human beings decided to create and perpetuate. And we can reimagine a different world where our baseline, right? Our baseline is our respect your humanity. I don't have to agree with the decisions you make. I can think they're wrong, morally. I can think whatever the case may be. But again, I don't know any theology that allows you to dehumanize somebody based on your belief of it. And so again, I will end with that, thinking about how we can understand when we think about or have a respect for young Black youth and their activism. At the baseline was this ideal of respecting one's humanity. And if we look at the America's movement in particular, it's about treating somebody, right, with a certain level of respect. And that could go a long way into ensuring that a person has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the creed of what supposedly makes America unique. And so I'll say thank you for that, and I open up for questions. Okay.
The railroad, he was transferred there, and we were always considered an outsider. You were not accepted unless your great grandparents lived there in America. It was the worst town I've ever been to in my life. But it was a good town. I mean, it was a good place to kind of grow up, but you were not accepted. It didn't matter what color you were. You were not accepted. The outsider, when I was in college, I left there in 52 when I went off to college. I graduated from American High School.
Okay. Yep.
But when I went off to college, I had only heard about Blacks. But when I went off to college, you heard all about Jews and Catholics. And I mean, nobody was accepted in America unless your great grandparents had lived there and you grew up there.
It's kind of lineage, yeah.
And they died in America in 57. When you left from 45 to 57, but you always felt like you never was accepted. And then in high, there was like 3 classes. They thought there was 3 classes. The people that were up here in the first class, they were the ones, some of them had money. Their grandparents and great grandparents had lived that all their life. Then I was in the middle class, and then you had the lower class. And these are all white people.
Yeah.
But the people that were really mistreated so much there too that I saw were the Catholics and the Jews.
Right. Yeah.
They were really they were outsiders too. They really were. But Americans did not want any growth back then.
Yeah.
They only had, I don't know how in the world Manhattan shirt factory got in there.
Right.
They got in there. But that was the only business that they had. They wanted.
Yeah. America has an interesting history, to your point. They actually had I don't hope I'm not mispronouncing the Kanoa Farm, which was like this kind of interfaith farm system. It was right outside of Americas. It was in the Cornell Farm, right? Right. And so
They were really mistreated.
right. It's right. So right.
They could not go to the Baptist church either.
Right. So yeah, so I talk about that more. So I do go through these very complicated histories, particularly like in America, it's very unique to it's very unique in Southwest Georgia, more so than Tifton and Moultrie, because Moultrie and Tifton had more of it was more of a like a Atlanta appeal, meaning, you know, I want to present myself as a business, you know, as a business place more so than, you know, it's kind of very racialized place. And so, yeah, but to your point about there are these different levels, right, of inequity. But I think that goes back to Baldwin's quote, right? And so the idea that we have, you know, and I tell students this all the time, and people don't like when I say it, but I'm like, it's just data. I mean, it's like there are ways in which America has perfected inequities. I mean, it's like we find ways to find differences, even if you remove race, right? Or it's always these very interconnected. And I think, and that's why I always talk about like how as I get old, my grandmother's love to man something resonates with me more and more, because it's this idea that you can't, when you learn to justify dehumanizing someone, there's no limits to what you would do to that person, right? Like, and that's what I tell students. Like, if we have learned anything in our human history, is that it oftentimes comes with or associated with some narrative about a particular group, and that narrative is normally negative, and that's because it's very hard for somebody to mistreat you if they see you as equal, but it's easy for them to mistreat you if they see you as something other than human or something less than human. And so I think, to your point, that in America, it's not necessarily just about a racial dynamic. You also had this class dynamic operating, this ideal about legacy. And so, and again, that's why I always go back to this Baldwin quote about some of these differences. It's just about one's inability to recognize one's humanity. And that's very hard to kind of get over. If I know you don't see me as human, it's really hard for me to have anything else to do with you, unless I just absolutely have to. And so that's this constant tension. Yes, and then Penny, I did that. Go ahead.
What are you hearing from your students? What kind of dialogue are they sharing?
I mean, I don't really get a lot of pushback, because again, like I tell students, my job is to present you information. I'm not trying to change your political belief. I'm not trying to. What I want you to do is think more critical about it. I don't think justice is a political party's responsibility. I believe justice is a human responsibility. I think regardless of how you think we get there, now there may be a Republican that think we get there this way, or a Democrat think we get there this way, or a Libertarian think we get there this way. But I tell students, my argument is that if you're arguing that we shouldn't try to get there, now if you say we shouldn't try to get there, then that's a whole different conversation. And so I mean, outside of just these ideas about, you know, interpretation about how, you know, this progress or whatever case may be, we may have like these different kind of tensions with that. But I always just try to start with a baseline about what is the conversation we're having, and are you saying these inequities exist? And I think what politicians have done so well about, and I tell you I'm a Tupac scholar, so I believe in naming names. So when I'm talking about politicians, I'm talking about the DeSantis of the world, the Kemps of the world. I think what they have done is use a political base to drive a personal ideology. So some of this stuff is not even happening, right? It's not even happening in schools, but it's like you're distracting people from the social problem. And so I try to keep the main thing in class. We're talking about the social problem. So the social problem is, in America, was about treatment. They weren't saying they were being mistreated by Republicans or being mistreated by Democrats. They were saying they were being mistreated by a system. And so what is our job? Again, what is our role in making sure that people are treated at a baseline level? And so I think if we, you know, my philosophy is keep the main thing. Because to me, a lot of that stuff is just is distractions. And so if I'm able to just show you, okay, well, this is that person's political agenda. They have no that agenda does not address any social problem. Like any social problem. It's not going to get people more Medicare. It's not going to get people more. It's not going to give people anything. It's not going to make, you know, a livable wage or whatever case may be. So I have a couple weeks ago in class, I told students to look at the livable wage in your area. What does economists say you need to live a basic life? And then so at that point, you know, those are numbers. It's like if I tell somebody, okay, in Jonesboro, Georgia, a living wage is $16.85 for a single person, and it's $23 for a person with a child, and it's $32 for a person, for a family. Which, at that point, it's okay. Well, what do we do about this? And the federal minimum wage is $7.25. That's a social problem. And then so I just, I don't really, have a. I mean, people may say what they say, outside of class, but I'm only telling us who we are. I'm not trying to convince you about who we're not. I'm not making up anything. I'm just telling you who we are. And if we find with the world we've created, then just say, let's be bold enough to say, we winners and losers, nanny boo boo, you lost. But let's quit. If we're gonna do that, let's be honest with it. Let's not keep calling ourselves a democracy. And we have created winners and losers. And so I'm asking students, are we satisfied with having these advantages and disadvantages and calling ourselves something that we say? And if we are, then let's just be honest enough to say we fine with that. But let's be honest enough to say we've created that world. And again, that's why I think the idea of reimagining is so important, because we don't have to have this world. We really do not have to live like this. We have chosen to live like this. And so I just keep the main thing. Penny and then Tamika. Mhm. Mhm.
They look, the young like that, and the one that, the 80s like that, they look like that. Milk.
Yeah. I mean, so one of my participants, who's passed several years ago, she had a battle with cancer, Sandra Mansfield, talked about she can remember being, I want to say she said like 8 or 9 years old, and she told her mother, she said her mother was braiding her hair, and she said she looked up at her mother and said, when the movement comes to Americas, I'm joining. And so at that time, I don't know how many of us have children, but I assume most people in this room got children. People, I tell people all the time, children have a lot to say in families. If you don't believe it, just go follow somebody home with children. And so, so, and I think we have to just, again, recondition ourselves, rethink about what we think about children as participants in the society, right? I had another conversation with students about why do you have to be 18 to vote, right? Why, who made that saying up, or who created that law? And there's scholars who talk about how we went from 21, because you used to have to be 21 in America, then it was 18 because the argument was, well, people can join the military at 18, and so it became service, and so it's this conversation. Yeah, so you had some of these. I mean, in the Birmingham movement, the Children's Crusade, you had kids as young as 5, in there. We just celebrated Black History Month. Ruby Bridges. I think she was, when she desegregated New Orleans, I think she was 5 or 6 years old. And so, yeah, you cover the gamut from 5 to, youth activism. My focus on youth is mostly primary and secondary age student. But SNCC, who are mostly college students, young adults, they are involved in it too. Yeah, so it's in there. Tamika. Right. Mm-hmm.
But the fact that how they were charged as insurrectionists,
Right.
how that became a death penalty case.
Right.
It's like you're basically fighting for your humanity, and now you're being told, if I get convicted, I'm going to be put to death just to fight to be recognized as a human. One of the things that I saw recently in the 1619 Project, which is on Netflix, and of course it's controversial. Some people say it's controversial. But in the first episode, the moderator talks to civil rights activists and talk about how he was a member, I think he was a member of SNCC, and how he got arrested. And they actually put him in prison farm. And they in some very inhumane situations where he was literally hung from the rafters by his wrist. And, you know, just left there to starve, and she was covered in feces and everything else. And so when the group came through to see how they would get treated, when they saw that treatment.
Yeah.
And so I think when we talk about a lot of these, deal with the trauma, the lasting trauma.
Yeah.
That each individual was fighting for the right to be recognized as an American citizen.
Yeah.
Not second class, just as an American citizen because they were born here. Their families helped lay the foundation of this country, but because of the color of their skin, and we're still being treated a certain kind of way. And so we, as the descendants of that, and even as recipients, because the civil rights movement is the blueprint for the world, not just for the U.S., not just for African Americans, the gay and lesbians, all of them, they use that as a blueprint of how to protest. We have to pay homage to them and the struggles that they went through, the trauma they endured, because it's lasting trauma. And so it's like, we need to teach the kids, this is what they, and it's unfortunate that we're in a situation now where people are saying, okay, you can't teach certain things. That's right. They don't want you to teach the truth. Certain kids to feel a certain kind of way. And I probably shouldn't be saying this because I'm still on the clock. But we have to have the understanding that we have to teach history as it is. It's not pretty. It is not pretty. It's not clear cut. It's not black and white. It's actually gray. There's a lot of gray areas. And so that's why situations like this is important, where we can come together, have this honest dialogue. And as the quote from James Baldwin says, we can agree to disagree all day long, but just recognize that each of us is still human. And so James Baldwin is a very interesting individual, and I love to see him. Look at that on Netflix. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah,
but yeah, this is very important. And I thank you for doing the work that you did to highlight what they endured afterwards, because sometimes it is glossed over. And what me and Kenny learned, there's a lot of information.
Yeah.
You have to wade through a lot. But then also when you're doing the researching themselves, I know for me, we have to deal with our own emotions that comes up.
Yeah.
It's difficult going through that stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm tearing up now because you know about the history, but when you start looking at my
right.
I think if people, not just black, if we learn about those individuals, we ourselves are inspired and motivated to do our own part and build our own piece of social justice.
Yeah.
My piece of social justice is process of collection. My piece is share those collections with the world.
Right. Yeah.
Share it with researchers like you who take it, take that narrative, and put it out there.
Yeah.
And turn around and teach it to the next generation so that they will know the history that we won't be hopefully doomed to repeat.
You bring up excellent points. And I once was at this talk and I said, we often talk about American history like we talk about our grandparents, right? That what we see them as is what they've always been, right? And I think that nostalgia. Hassan Jeffries, who's a professor at Ohio State, he talks about like nostalgia versus history. He gives his TED talk about kind of what we love is nostalgia. We don't really like history. We like to tell ourselves stories about the past that doesn't reflect the messiness, and I say the ugly beauty of the past, right? And I remember I made this statement to somebody. I was teaching a class. I taught a class before I got to University of Alabama. I used to teach at Kennesaw State. And we was having this conversation about identity and things like that. Somehow Cardi B came up or whatever case may be, right? And I said, well, what do you think about Maya Angelou? And then they was like, well, you know, Maya Angelou is Maya Angelou. She's a Pulitzer Prize. But I said, but Maya Angelou had a life prior to her becoming the phenomenal woman, right? Maya Angelou, on some level, one would argue, and it's not me making it up. This is Maya Angelou's documentary, her bio, on Netflix, where she was considered a adult entertainer in her day. Now I know to some people that's shocking, right? You know, how could you blaspheme Maya Angelou like that? But that's the ugly beauty of our complex life. And until we understand to embrace that complexity, we're always going to talk about nostalgia over history. It's always going to be what we tell ourselves about the past more so than what the past is. And I think it does a disservice to all those who not only fought for it, but also live with that trauma. Because on some level, we place our comfort over not only their trauma, but also all of these demands actually went on some level unfulfilled to its fullest extent. So not only do we ignore their trauma, we also ignore their ideas and actions. And so I think, and again, this is the world we have chosen, and we have to. That's a decision that we make. And I think I'm being moved off stage there.
It is 1 o'clock, so I just want to let, if you want to stay and continue speaking, you're more than welcome to. But if you've got someplace to be, I don't want you to feel like you're trapped in here. So, number one, thank you for a very fascinating presentation. You don't have to run away. I would say it's just from a personal note, like I'm obviously I'm not American, I'm South African, as the accent gives it away. So I find this very interesting, especially with the corollaries of you speaking about how, well, Tamika mentioned that these are lessons to the rest of the world. And from my own history through apartheid, a lot of these things were used in our own resistance against oppressive governments and things. So it's very important that this keeps getting taught. And remember that history isn't yesterday or 10 years ago. History is right now, and we are impacting the next generation. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And as a thank you, we have Spanish in Georgia for you.
There you go.
A few announcements before we can obviously keep the conversation going if you'd like. We have several events coming up in April, including our annual History Symposium on the 1st. This year, it's on Georgia, nature, and the environment. And we have a new exhibit opening the same day on Georgia's historic disasters and disaster planning. Our next Lunch and Learn is Stories of Atlanta, Iron and Ambition by Lance Russell, where he'll explain how his interest in storytelling fueled a 50-year filmmaking career and eventually led him to discover his passion for telling stories of Atlanta through his YouTube channel of the same name. And we hope you can join us then.
When's that?
That, I do not know the date of that yet. Hold on, we're getting a calendar check quickly in the background. The 14th of April. Please put that in your calendar and we hope to all see you. And if you would like to continue any of this conversation, we encourage you to keep this dialogue going because I think it's very important, the discussions that are happening here.
Thank you all for having me. Yes, sir.
In high school, we learned about the caste system in India.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We kind of put it down. But, just 100 so many years before that, we had slavery in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, there were untouchables in India. People mistreated them, and they got the lowest jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In America, we had slavery, and we could basically do whatever we wanted to that person.
Right.
We bought them their soul, their body, etc.
Right.
So really bad.
Yeah. I think it goes back to what. Yeah. Yeah. I think like we convinced ourselves that a person, a walking, breathing, talking person was is similar to this podium properly. Like that's law. And so we can convince ourselves of anything. So if we are just as determining to convince ourselves of ignoring the things we see, we can be just as determined to convince ourselves to reimagine what we can't see. So I agree with you. I think slavery is an excellent example. The caste is excellent. All these things are things that human beings created. We made it up. Right. You think about Black women who were seen as property, and then they would breastfeed not only their kids but also their owners' kids and things. It was a grand contradiction. So we can reimagine ourselves thinking something different. And so that's really, I think, where I come away with this activism stuff. That's why I constantly look at the ideas and action of young people to see what world are they imagining in real time and how are we responding to the world in which they're reimagining. And I think they have provided themselves, you know, in hindsight, I mean, if we would have taken, you know, 40%, 50% of what, you know, they were fighting for, America's would have been a very different place, right? Tiffany would have been a very different place. Georgia would have been a very different place. And we decided on some level to double down on relics and ideas of Jim Crow, of superiority, of somebody having to be on the bottom so I can feel good to be on the top. I mean, we constantly create these hierarchies to feel good about ourselves. Whereas in this ideal of just embracing one's humanity and figure out, well, how can we live if we just at a baseline respect one's humanity? It's a novel thought. Yeah. All right, so good people, I sure thank you. You enjoy your Friday, and thank you again, Tracy, Penny, and Tamika for inviting me. And I look forward to, you know, hopefully, look forward to the work you are doing here at the Georgia Archives, and Penny, the work you're doing at Clayton State, and the rest of the work you all are doing wherever you're doing it at, and just keep giving them hell.